The bullet that killed Marshal Edward Andrews in the spring of 1875 didn't just take a lawman from the dusty streets of Tucson, Arizona Territory. It shattered the heart of his 23-year-old daughter and left her more guarded than the gold shipments that rolled through town twice a month. Miriam Andrews stood at her father's grave 3 days after the shooting, her dark green eyes dry despite the tears that wanted to fall, her jaw set in a line that made her look older than her years. The April sun beat down on the mourners gathered in the small cemetery on the edge of town, and she could feel their pitying stares like flies buzzing around rotting meat. She didn't want their pity. She didn't want their casseroles or their whispered condolences or their suggestions that she should move back east where a young woman belonged. What she wanted was her father back, and since that was impossible, she wanted everyone to leave her alone. The man who killed her father had been a drifter named Cole Hastings, and he was already dead too, shot down by Deputy Tom Rawlings not 10 minutes after he'd pulled the trigger on the marshal. It should have brought Miriam some satisfaction, but it didn't. Nothing could fill the hollow space where her father's laughter used to live, where his gentle guidance and steady presence had shaped her into the woman she'd become. After the funeral, Miriam went back to the small house she'd shared with her father and locked the door. The town council had already informed her that she had 30 days to vacate the property, as it came with the marshal's position. 30 days to pack up a lifetime of memories and figure out where a woman alone was supposed to go in a territory that ate up the weak and unprepared like a hungry wolf. She had some money saved, enough to last a few months if she was careful. Her father had taught her to shoot, to ride, to think clearly in a crisis. He'd raised her without a mother since she was 6 years old, when cholera had swept through their previous town in Kansas. Marshal Andrews had been unconventional in his parenting, treating his daughter more like a deputy in training than a delicate flower to be protected from the harsh realities of frontier life. Miriam knew she needed to find work, and fast. The problem was that respectable jobs for women in Tucson were limited to teaching, sewing, cooking, or working in one of the saloons. She had no patience for children. Her sewing was barely adequate for mending her own clothes, and she'd rather eat cactus needles than serve drinks to rowdy cowboys who thought a woman alone was an invitation. That left very few options, and as she sat in her father's chair that evening, running her fingers over the worn armrests where his hands had rested so many times, an idea began to form. It was wild and probably foolish, but it beat the alternative of leaving Tucson and starting over somewhere else where she'd have no connections and no history. She would open a business. Not a dress shop or a boarding house, but something the town actually needed. She'd watched her father work for years, had seen how the jail office operated, how records were kept, how the flow of information moved through the town. What Tucson needed was a proper records office, someone to keep track of land deeds, birth and death certificates, business licenses, and all the other paperwork that made civilization possible even in this dusty corner of the Arizona Territory. The next morning, Miriam put on her best dress, a simple gray cotton with black trim that was somber enough for mourning but practical enough for business, and walked to the office of Martin Wheeler, the head of the town council. Wheeler was a portly man in his 50s who owned the largest general store in Tucson and had a reputation for being fair-minded, if somewhat patronizing toward women. "Miss Andrews," he said when she was shown into his office behind the store, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was a fine man and a good marshal." "Thank you, Mr. Wheeler," Miriam said, sitting down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited. She saw his eyebrows rise slightly at her forwardness, but she didn't care. If she was going to survive in this town, she couldn't afford to play the helpless female. "I've come to discuss a business proposal." Wheeler leaned back in his chair, his fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin. "I'm listening." Miriam laid out her plan, speaking clearly and confidently, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. She explained how the town's records were scattered across various offices and private homes, how there was no central system for tracking important documents, how this lack of organization was costing the town time and money. She proposed to establish a records office, to be paid through small fees for filing and retrieving documents, plus a modest monthly stipend from the town council for maintaining public records. When she finished, Wheeler was quiet for a long moment. "It's an interesting idea, Miss Andrews," he finally said, "but I have to be honest with you. This town council isn't inclined to fund what they'll see as unnecessary bureaucracy. And as for the fees, well, most folks around here don't see the value in paying for paperwork when they can just keep their own documents in a drawer at home." "With all due respect, Mr. Wheeler, that's short-sighted," Miriam said, her voice sharp. "What happens when there's a dispute over land boundaries? Or when someone needs to prove they own a business? Or when the territorial government requires documentation that nobody can find? My office would prevent those problems and save people money in the long run." Wheeler studied her for a moment, and she could see him reassessing her. "You've got your father's spine, I'll give you that. Tell you what, I'll bring it to the council, but I can't promise anything. In the meantime, you might want to consider other options. A young woman like yourself shouldn't be alone. Have you thought about marriage?" Miriam felt her jaw tighten. "My father has been dead less than a week, Mr. Wheeler. Marriage is the last thing on my mind." Of course," Wheeler said quickly. "I only meant that in the future it would solve a lot of your problems. A husband could provide for you, protect you." "I can protect myself," Miriam said, standing up. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wheeler. I'll wait to hear from the council." She walked out of his office with her head high, but inside she was seething. Marriage. Everyone's solution for what to do with an inconvenient woman. As if she should just attach herself to the first man willing to have her, surrender what little independence she had, and spend the rest of her life cooking and cleaning and producing babies. She'd seen enough marriages in her 23 years to know that most of them were transactions rather than love matches, and she wanted no part of it. Her heart was her own, and after watching her father die in a pool of blood on Main Street, she knew that caring too deeply about anyone was a luxury she couldn't afford. The next few days passed in a blur of packing and sorting. Miriam went through her father's belongings with dry eyes, setting aside things to keep and things to sell or give away. His badge went into a small wooden box along with some letters he'd written her over the years when he'd had to travel for work. His rifle, she kept, it was a good Winchester, well-maintained, and she knew how to use it. His clothes she donated to the church, except for one shirt that still smelled like him, a mix of leather and tobacco and soap. On the 4th day after her visit to Wheeler, she had a visitor. She heard the knock on the door around mid-morning and opened it to find a tall cowboy standing on her porch, hat in hand, his brown hair slightly mussed from where the hat had been. He had an honest face with hazel eyes that met hers directly, and he looked to be around her own age, maybe a year or two older. "Miss Andrews," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone with a slight Texas drawl. "My name is Vincent Bailey. I worked with your father a few times when there was trouble out at the ranch where I'm employed. I just wanted to pay my respects and say how sorry I am for your loss." Miriam studied him for a moment. She vaguely remembered her father mentioning a young cowboy named Vincent who'd helped track down some cattle rustlers the previous fall. "Thank you, Mr. Bailey," That's kind of you. Vincent shifted his weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable but determined to continue. I also wanted to say that if you need anything help moving or repairs around the house, or just someone to fetch heavy items from the store, I'd be happy to assist. No payment needed. Your father was a good man, and I'd like to help his daughter if I can. It was a generous offer, and Miriam could see that it was sincerely meant. But she'd already learned that accepting help from men usually came with strings attached, whether they admitted it or not. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Bailey, but I can manage. Something flickered in his eyes, disappointment maybe, or understanding. Of course, madam, but the offer stands if you change your mind. I'm at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles north of town. Anyone can point you in the right direction if you need to find me. He put his hat back on, tipped it politely, and walked back to where a sturdy bay horse was tied to her fence post. Miriam watched him mount up with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, and then he rode away without looking back. She closed the door and returned to her packing, pushing the encounter out of her mind. She didn't need help from Vincent Bailey or anyone else. She'd learned long ago that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. But over the next week, Vincent Bailey kept showing up. He never pushed, never insisted, never made her feel obligated. He'd just appear at opportune moments when she was struggling to carry a heavy trunk to the wagon she'd borrowed, when a shutter on the house came loose and needed repairing, when her horse threw a shoe and she was leading it toward the blacksmith. Each time, he'd offer help with that same polite, genuine manner, and each time she'd initially refuse, only to find him quietly assisting anyway in a way that made it seem like he was just happening to be there rather than deliberately seeking her out. "You're very persistent, Mr. Bailey," she said on the 5th such encounter, when he'd helped her load a heavy dresser onto the wagon without being asked. He gave her a small smile, the first real expression she'd seen on his face beyond polite concern. "My mama always said I was stubborn as a Missouri mule, Miss Andrews, but I prefer to think of it as being determined." "There's a fine line between determination and nuisance," Miriam said, but there was less edge in her voice than there might have been a week earlier. "Yes, madam, there sure is," Vincent agreed. "I hope I haven't crossed it, but I figure a person who's grieving shouldn't have to struggle with heavy furniture on top of everything else." Miriam looked at him properly for the first time, really seeing him instead of just registering him as another person trying to insert themselves into her life. He had a weathered face despite his youth, the kind of deep tan that came from years of outdoor work. His hands were calloused and scarred from ranch work, but his movements were careful and controlled. There was something solid about him, something dependable. "I'm not very good at accepting help," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "I've noticed," Vincent said, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "But maybe that's because you've had to be self-reliant for so long. Doesn't mean you have to do everything alone, though. Sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, it's just being practical." She wanted to argue with him, but she was tired. Tired of packing, tired of grieving, tired of holding herself together with nothing but pride and stubbornness. "Fine," she said. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Bailey. I do appreciate it, even if I'm terrible at showing it." His smile widened just a fraction. "You're welcome, Miss Andrews, and you can call me Vincent if you'd like. Mr. Bailey makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and working in a bank." "Vincent, then," Miriam said, "but I'm still Miss Andrews to you." "Wouldn't dream of calling you anything else," Vincent said, tipping his hat. "Unless you tell me otherwise." After he left that day, Miriam found herself thinking about him more than she wanted to. He was different from the other men who'd approached her since her father's death. Some had been awkwardly sympathetic, Some had been opportunistic in a way that made her skin crawl, and some had been outright hostile to the idea of a woman trying to establish herself independently. But Vincent Bailey was none of those things. He was just helpful, kind, patient. It made her suspicious. In her experience, people didn't help without expecting something in return. But as the days passed, and Vincent continued to show up at useful moments, never asking for anything, never making inappropriate comments or suggestions, never pushing for more of her time or attention than she was willing to give, she began to wonder if maybe she was wrong about him. The town council rejected her proposal for the records office. Martin Wheeler delivered the news himself, looking apologetic but not surprised. "They think it's too risky to fund, Miss Andrews. I'm sorry. I did try to advocate for you." Miriam had expected the rejection, but it still stung. "Thank you for trying, Mr. Wheeler." "There is one other thing," Wheeler said, hesitating. "Samuel Morrison is looking for someone to help in his law office. He needs a clerk to organize files and copy documents. It's not what you proposed, but it's respectable work and it pays fairly. Would you be interested?" It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Samuel Morrison was one of the few lawyers in Tucson, a serious man in his 40s who handled everything from land disputes to criminal defense. Working for him wouldn't give her the independence she'd hoped for, but it would give her income and a reason to stay in Tucson. "Yes," Miriam said, "I'd be interested. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler." She started working for Morrison the following Monday. The law office was a cramped space above a dry goods store, filled with towering stacks of papers and books that smelled of dust and old leather. Morrison was a precise, particular man who spoke in careful legal language and expected perfection from his employees. He was also, Miriam discovered, surprisingly respectful of her abilities. When she suggested a better system for organizing his files, he listened. When she caught an error in a property deed he was preparing, he thanked her rather than taking offense. The work was tedious but satisfying in its own way. There was something calming about bringing order to chaos, about creating systems where none had existed. And the pay was enough to allow her to rent a small room in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patricia Chen, whose late husband had been Chinese, and who understood what it was like to be an outsider in a town that didn't always welcome difference. Vincent Bailey continued to appear in her life with surprising regularity. She'd see him in town on Saturdays when she was shopping for supplies, and he'd tip his hat and sometimes walk with her for a block or two, carrying her packages without being asked. He'd show up at the boarding house occasionally, asking Mrs. Chen if there were any repairs needed, and then fixing loose steps or leaky faucets while Miriam watched from a distance, not quite able to shake the feeling that he was doing it more for her sake than for the boarding house. "That young man is sweet on you, Mrs. Chen said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. "He's just being helpful," Miriam said, but even she could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. Mrs. Chen laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Helpful, yes. But he's helpful to you in particular. I've seen the way he looks at you when you're not paying attention, like you're water in the desert." Miriam felt her cheeks warm. "I'm not interested in romance, Mrs. Chen. I have too much else to worry about." "Romance isn't something you schedule, dear," the older woman said gently. "It just happens, whether you're ready for it or not. The question is whether you're brave enough to let it." "I'm not afraid," Miriam said, a little too quickly. Mrs. Chen gave her a knowing look but didn't push. "Of course not. But there's a difference between being strong and being closed off. Don't confuse the two." That conversation lingered in Miriam's mind over the following weeks. Summer was approaching. bringing with it the intense heat that made the Arizona Territory feel like standing next to a forge. She'd been in Tucson for 3 months since her father's death, and she was beginning to feel like she might actually survive this. She had work, she had a place to live, she had a routine. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but it was hers. Vincent's visits had become something she looked forward to, though she wouldn't have admitted it out loud. He had a way of making her feel less alone without being intrusive about it. He'd tell her stories about life on the ranch, about the other cowboys he worked with, about the landscape and the animals and the simple rhythms of that world. He never pried into her feelings or pushed her to talk about her father, but he was always willing to listen if she wanted to. One Saturday in June, Vincent showed up at the boarding house with a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Afternoon, Miss Andrews," he said when she answered the door. "I was wondering if you might like to take a ride out to the river. It's cooler there and I brought some food. Nothing fancy, just bread and cheese and some fruit, but I thought you might enjoy getting out of town for a few hours." Miriam hesitated. Going on a picnic with a man was dangerously close to courting behavior, and she'd been careful to keep things friendly but distant with Vincent. But the heat was oppressive. The boarding house was stifling despite Mrs. Chen's best efforts to keep it cool, and the idea of spending a few hours by the water was tempting. "Just as friends," she said, making it a condition rather than a question. "Just as friends," Vincent agreed easily. "I promise to be a perfect gentleman, Miss Andrews, Scout's honor." She found herself smiling despite her reservations. "Give me a few minutes to change and let Mrs. Chen know where I'm going." They rode out together on their horses, Vincent on his bay and Miriam on the sturdy mare she'd bought with some of her savings. The river was about 3 miles from town, a thin ribbon of water that wound through the desert like a green snake. Cottonwood trees grew along its banks, providing precious shade, and the sound of the water was soothing after the constant noise of Tucson. Vincent spread a blanket in the shade and unpacked the basket while Miriam sat down, grateful to be off her horse and in the relative cool. The food was simple but good, and they ate in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the birds and the water and the breeze rustling through the leaves. "Can I ask you something?" Vincent said eventually, his tone careful. "You can ask," Miriam said. "I might not answer," he smiled at that. "Fair enough. Why are you so determined to keep everyone at arm's length?" It was a more direct question than she'd expected from him, and for a moment she considered deflecting or changing the subject. But there was something about the way he asked, without judgment or demand, that made her want to answer honestly. "Because caring about people means losing them," she said, staring at the water. "My mother died when I was 6. My father was killed 3 months ago. Everyone I've ever loved has left one way or another. So why would I set myself up for that kind of pain again?" Vincent was quiet for a moment. "My parents died when I was 15, he said softly. "Fever took them both within a week of each other. I have a sister back in Texas, married with kids, but I haven't seen her in years. I know what it's like to lose people you love." Miriam looked at him, surprised by this revelation. He'd never talked about his family before. "How do you stand it? Aren't you angry all the time?" "I was for a while," Vincent admitted. "Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at myself for not being able to save them. But staying angry didn't bring them back, and it didn't make my life any better. So eventually I decided that the best way to honor them was to keep living, keep trying to be the kind of person they raised me to be. That meant being open to connections with other people, even knowing I might lose them too." "That seems like a good way to get your heart broken over and over," Miriam said. "Maybe," Vincent said. "But the alternative is spending your whole life alone, never letting anyone in, never experiencing the good parts of caring about someone. That seems worse to me than the risk of loss. Miriam wanted to argue, but she couldn't quite find the words. What he was saying made sense on some level, even if it terrified her to think about actually applying it to her own life. I don't know if I'm brave enough for that. You're one of the bravest people I know, Vincent said, and there was such sincerity in his voice that it made her chest tighten. You've survived things that would have broken other people. You've built a life for yourself in a town that doesn't make it easy for women to be independent. That takes courage. Letting yourself care about people, that's just a different kind of brave. They stayed by the river until the sun started to sink toward the horizon, talking about easier topics, books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they'd had before life got complicated. Miriam found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since before her father's death, and when Vincent smiled at something she said, she felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat. On the ride back to town, with the sky turning purple and gold above them, Vincent said, "I'd like to do this again sometime if you're willing. No pressure, just spending time together. I enjoy your company, Miss Andrews." Miriam looked over at him, sitting easy in his saddle, his face open and honest in the fading light. Something in her chest loosened just a fraction. "I'd like that too," she heard herself say. "And you can call me Miriam if you want, when we're alone anyway." The smile that spread across Vincent's face was like sunrise. "Miriam," he said, testing the name. "I like it. It suits you." Over the summer and into the fall, Vincent and Miriam fell into a pattern of spending time together. They went riding on Sunday afternoons when both had time off from work. He brought her books from the ranch owner's extensive library, novels and poetry and history books that fed her hungry mind. She helped him write letters to his sister, correcting his spelling and suggesting phrases when he got stuck trying to express what he felt. They talked about everything and nothing, and slowly, so slowly she barely noticed it happening, the walls around Miriam's heart began to crack. Vincent never pushed for more than she was willing to give. He didn't try to kiss her or hold her hand or make declarations of love. He just showed up, consistently and patiently, proving through his actions that he was someone she could rely on. He was there when she had a bad day at work and needed to vent about Morrison's exacting standards. He was there when the anniversary of her father's death rolled around, and she couldn't face being around people, but also couldn't bear to be alone. He was there when her horse went lame and needed to be replaced, helping her negotiate with the horse trader to get a fair price. The other cowboys at the Double R Ranch teased him about his frequent trips to town, but Vincent didn't seem to care. "Let them talk," he told Miriam once when she expressed concern that she was taking up too much of his time. "They're just jealous that I have someone worth riding into town to see." In October, Vincent's foreman at the ranch fell from his horse and broke his arm, and Vincent was promoted to take his place temporarily. It meant more responsibility and better pay, but also longer hours and more time spent managing the other cowboys rather than doing the work alongside them. Miriam could see the stress it caused him, the way his shoulders were tighter and his smile came less easily. "Tell me about your day," she said one Sunday as they sat by the river, which had swollen with autumn rains. "And don't say it was fine. I can see it wasn't." Vincent sighed, pulling off his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Being in charge is harder than I thought it would be. Some of the men don't like taking orders from someone their own age, and I'm constantly worried I'm going to make the wrong decision and cost the ranch money or get someone hurt." "What would you do if you could do anything?" Miriam asked. "If money and practical considerations weren't a factor?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow past. "I'd have my own place," he he said eventually. Nothing huge, just a small ranch where I could raise horses. Good horses, the kind that are smart and reliable, not just pretty. I've always had a way with horses better than with cattle. And I'd have a family. A wife who was my partner, not just someone to cook and clean. Kids who I could teach to ride and to treat animals with respect. A home that felt permanent, not just a bunkhouse I'm staying in until the next opportunity comes along. The longing in his voice made Miriam's heart ache. "That's a good dream," she said softly. "What about you?" Vincent asked, turning to look at her. "What would you do if you could do anything?" Miriam thought about it. A few months ago, her answer would have been about independence and self-sufficiency, about proving she didn't need anyone. But now, sitting beside Vincent with the autumn sun warm on her face, her answer was different. "I'd have my records office," she said. "A real one, not just working for someone else. I'd have a place where people could come to file documents and get help navigating the bureaucracy of the territory. And I'd have—" She paused, surprised by what she was about to say. "I'd have someone to share it with. Someone who understood that I need to work, that I need something of my own beyond just being someone's wife or mother. Someone who could be a true partner." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement of what they were both beginning to feel but hadn't yet said out loud. "Miriam," Vincent said, his voice low and serious, "I need you to know that I care about you, not just as a friend, though you are that, but as someone I want in my life in a more permanent way. I'm not asking you to marry me right now or even to commit to anything. I just need you to know how I feel, and that I'm willing to wait for as long as it takes for you to feel safe enough to let me in completely." Miriam's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was the moment she'd been half expecting and half dreading for months. The moment when she had to decide if she was brave enough to risk her heart again. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm terrified, Vincent. What if something happens to you? What if I let myself love you and then I lose you too?" "That could happen," Vincent said, reaching out slowly to take her hand, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. His hand was warm and calloused and steady. "I can't promise I'll live forever or that nothing bad will ever happen. But I can promise that whatever time we have, I'll spend it being the best man I can be for you. And I think that's worth the risk. Don't you?" Miriam looked down at their joined hands, feeling the connection between them like a physical thing. She thought about the past months, how Vincent had shown up consistently, had been patient when she pushed him away, had respected her boundaries while still making his interest clear. He'd earned her trust one smile at a time, one kind gesture at a time, one honest conversation at a time. "Yes," she said finally, looking up to meet his eyes. "Yes, I think it's worth the risk." Vincent's face lit up with joy and he squeezed her hand gently. "Can I court you properly then?" "With the intention of marriage eventually when you're ready." "You've been courting me for months," Miriam said, and she found herself smiling, really smiling for what felt like the first time since her father died. "I was just too stubborn to admit it." "I don't mind stubborn," Vincent said, grinning. "I've gotten pretty good at working with it." He leaned in slowly, carefully, giving her every chance to stop him, and when his lips met hers it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Miriam felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked away and frozen for so long. It hurt, like blood flowing back into a limb that had fallen asleep, but it was a good hurt. A necessary hurt. When they pulled apart, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to make you happy," he said. "That's a promise." "I believe you," Miriam said, and she did. The courtship became official after that, which meant Vincent came to the boarding house for supervised visits and took Miriam to church on Sundays, and generally behaved in a way that made their intentions clear to the entire town. Mrs. Chen was delighted, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of propriety. Samuel Morrison, Miriam's employer, raised an eyebrow when he heard the news but said only that he hoped it wouldn't interfere with her work. It didn't. If anything, being happy made Miriam more efficient, more patient with Morrison's demands, more willing to go the extra mile on difficult cases. Winter came to the Arizona Territory, which mostly meant cooler temperatures and occasional rain rather than the snow and ice of more northern regions. Vincent's temporary position as foreman became permanent when the previous foreman decided to retire rather than wait for his arm to fully heal. The promotion came with a significant raise, and Vincent started talking more concretely about his dream of owning his own ranch someday. "I've been saving for years," he told Miriam one evening in December as they sat in the boarding house parlor with Mrs. Chen knitting in the corner as chaperone. "I figure in another 2 or 3 years I'll have enough to make a down payment on a small place. There's land available south of here, near the Santa Cruz River. Good grazing, access to water. It would be perfect for horses." "That's wonderful," Miriam said, genuinely pleased for him. But there was a small knot of anxiety in her stomach. Would he expect her to give up her work and become a rancher's wife? She loved him, and she did love him, though she hadn't quite worked up the courage to say it yet. But she didn't know if she could give up her independence completely, even for him. Vincent must have seen something in her face, because he reached over and took her hand. "I want you to be part of that dream, Miriam, not just as my wife, but as my partner. If you want to keep working for Morrison, we'll figure it out. If you want to finally open that records office, I'll help you make it happen. I don't want you to give up who you are for me. I fell in love with an independent, strong-minded woman, and I don't want to change that." "You love me," Miriam said, focusing on the most important part of what he'd said. Vincent's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't realized he'd said it out loud. "Yes," he said firmly, "I love you. I've loved you for months, probably since the first time you told me you didn't need my help and then grudgingly accepted it anyway. You don't have to say it back if you're not ready, but I wanted you to know." Miriam felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to. I tried not to, but I do." Mrs. Chen made a small, satisfied sound from her corner, and they both looked over to see her smiling at them over her knitting. "About time you two admitted it," she said. "I'll go make some tea to celebrate." After she bustled out of the room, Vincent pulled Miriam closer, and they sat together on the settee, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, just existing in the quiet happiness of having finally said the words that had been building between them for so long. "When should we get married?" Vincent asked after a while. "I know you might want to wait, and I don't want to rush you, but I also don't want to waste time now that we both know what we want." Miriam thought about it. A year ago, even 6 months ago, the idea of getting married would have felt like a trap, but with Vincent, it felt like possibility. "Spring," she said. "Let's get married in the spring. That gives us time to plan and save money and figure out the practical details." "Spring it is," Vincent agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They set a date for April, almost exactly a year after Marshal Andrews had been killed. It felt right to Miriam, like she was honoring her father's memory by allowing herself to be happy again, to build a new life even though his was over. She thought he would have liked Vincent, would have approved of his steady character and honest nature. The engagement was announced formally in January, and the town reacted with a mixture of approval and surprise. Some people were pleased to see the marshal's daughter settling down with a respectable cowboy. Others thought she should have aimed higher, Maybe try to catch a lawyer or a businessman rather than a ranch hand. Miriam didn't care what they thought. She'd learned that other people's opinions were just noise, meaningless unless you gave them power. Vincent gave her a ring in February, a simple gold band with a small garnet set into it. "It's not a diamond," he said apologetically when he presented it to her. "But garnets are supposed to represent love and trust, and I thought that was more important than a flashy stone." "It's perfect," Miriam said, slipping it onto her finger. "I wouldn't want anything else." They spent the months before the wedding planning their future in more detail. Vincent had been talking to the owner of the Double R Ranch, a wealthy man named Robert Richardson, who'd made his fortune in mining before retiring to ranching. Richardson was impressed with Vincent's work as foreman and his skill with horses, and he offered to co-sign a loan that would allow Vincent to buy land and start his ranch much sooner than he'd planned. "He says he sees it as an investment," Vincent told Miriam excitedly. "He'll get a percentage of the profits for the first 5 years, and in return, he's helping me get established. And he's offered to sell me 3 of his best mares at cost, so I'll have breeding stock to start with." "That's incredibly generous," Miriam said, though she wondered what Richardson was getting out of it beyond financial return. She'd learned to be suspicious of generosity that seemed too good to be true. But when she met with Richardson herself at Vincent's request, because Vincent wanted her input on the business arrangements, another sign of how much he valued her as a partner, she found the older man to be genuine in his interest in helping them. He was in his 60s, with no children of his own, and he seemed to view Vincent almost as a surrogate son. "Your young man has real talent with animals," Richardson told Miriam over coffee in his ranch house office. "And he's honest and hardworking, qualities that are rarer than they should be. I've been in this territory long enough to know that helping good people succeed is good business, and if I can help you two start your life together on solid footing, well, that's just good sense." Miriam relaxed a fraction. "We appreciate it, Mr. Richardson, more than we can say." "Call me Robert," Richardson said. "And tell me about this records office Vincent mentioned you want to open. That's an interesting ambition for a young woman." So Miriam explained her vision again, more refined now than it had been when she'd first proposed it to the town council. She talked about how the territory was growing, how more people were filing land claims and starting businesses, how the need for organized record-keeping was only going to increase. Richardson listened thoughtfully, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in a gesture that reminded her of Martin Wheeler. "Have you thought about starting small?" he asked. "Maybe working out of your home at first, building up a client base through word of mouth before trying to rent commercial space. That would keep your costs down and prove the viability of the business before you invest too heavily." It was good advice, practical and sensible. "I hadn't thought of that," Miriam admitted. "I was so focused on the official version that I didn't consider a more gradual approach." "That's one of the luxuries of age," Richardson said with a smile. "You learn that most good things are built slowly, piece by piece. Patience pays off in the long run." The conversation stayed with Miriam over the following weeks. Maybe she'd been too rigid in her thinking, too focused on doing things one specific way. Maybe there was room for flexibility, for growing into her dreams rather than demanding they manifest, fully formed. She talked to Vincent about it, and they decided that, after the wedding, they'd use part of their combined savings to buy a small house in town, rather than living on the ranch property. That way, Miriam could maintain her work with Morrison while also starting her records office on the side, and Vincent could travel between town and the ranch property he was buying, which was only about 4 miles out. It wouldn't be easy, but they were both used to hard work. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in mid-April, in the same church where Miriam had attended her father's funeral service a year earlier. The contrast between those 2 days was stark. One the worst day of her life, one the best. Miriam wore a dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her make, a beautiful creation in cream-colored silk with lace trim that made her feel feminine without being fussy. Vincent wore a new suit that fit his lean frame perfectly, his hair neatly combed, his face shining with joy. Mrs. Chen stood up as Miriam's witness, and Vincent's friend Jack Donovan, another cowboy from the Double R Ranch, served as his. Samuel Morrison attended, along with Robert Richardson and about 20 other people from town who'd come to know Miriam and Vincent over the past year. It was a small wedding, but it was theirs, filled with people who genuinely cared about them. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, there was only supportive silence. And when he pronounced them husband and wife and Vincent kissed Miriam in front of everyone, she felt a sense of rightness that she'd never experienced before. This was where she was supposed to be, with this man, building this life. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Chen providing food and Robert Richardson supplying wine from his personal collection. There was music and dancing and laughter, and Miriam found herself thinking that her father would have loved this, would have been happy to see her so clearly cherished by a good man. As the sun set and the party wound down, Vincent and Miriam left for the small house they'd bought the month before. It was modest but solid, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a parlor that would eventually serve as Miriam's office. They'd spent weeks getting it ready, painting walls and fixing leaky pipes and making it feel like home. Their wedding night was gentle and sweet, marked by tenderness and a little awkwardness as they learned each other's bodies and rhythms. Miriam had been nervous, having only the vaguest idea of what to expect, but Vincent was patient and careful, and by the end of it she felt closer to him than she'd ever felt to another human being. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I love you too," Vincent murmured, his hand stroking her hair. "My stubborn, brilliant wife." She smiled against his skin. "Your wife. That still sounds strange." "You'll get used to it," Vincent promised. "We have the rest of our lives for you to get used to it." The first year of marriage was an adjustment, though not as difficult as Miriam had feared. Vincent split his time between the ranch he was building and their home in town, usually staying at the ranch 3 or 4 nights a week and coming home for the other nights. It wasn't ideal, but it was necessary, and they made the most of the time they had together. Miriam continued working for Morrison while slowly building her records business on the side. She started by offering her services to people she knew, filing documents and organizing paperwork for small fees. Word spread gradually, and within 6 months she had a small but steady stream of clients. Morrison, rather than being threatened by her side business, actually started referring people to her when they needed help with personal paperwork that didn't require a lawyer's expertise. Vincent's ranch was coming together piece by piece. He'd bought 60 acres of land with a creek running through it, and he'd built a small barn and some fencing with help from Jack Donovan and a few other cowboys from the Double R. His 3 mares were thriving, and one was pregnant with a foal due in early spring. He'd also bought a young stallion with excellent bloodlines, and he was beginning to develop a reputation for having quality horses for sale. Money was tight sometimes, but they managed. Miriam was careful with their budget, tracking every penny and finding ways to stretch their resources. Vincent worked brutally long hours, building and maintaining the ranch while still serving as foreman at the Double R to ensure steady income. But they were happy, genuinely happy, in a way that made the struggles feel worthwhile. In the fall of their first year of marriage, Miriam realized she was pregnant. She'd been feeling tired and nauseous for a few weeks, and when her monthly bleeding didn't come, she knew. The realization filled her with a complex mix of emotions, joy and terror in equal measure. She wanted a family with Vincent, had known when she married him that children would be part of their future. But the actual reality of it, of growing a human being inside her body, of taking on the responsibility of raising a child in this harsh territory, was overwhelming. She told Vincent on a Sunday evening after he'd been home for 2 days and was relaxed and happy from the time together. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, watching his face for his reaction. Vincent's eyes went wide, and then a smile spread across his face that was brighter than any she'd seen before. "Really? You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor confirming it," Miriam said. "I figure I'm about 2 months along." Vincent whooped with joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and demanded he put her down before she got sick on him. He set her down carefully, his hands going to her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "You're going to be a mother, I'm going to be a father." "Terrifying, isn't it?" Miriam said, but she was smiling. "Terrifying," Vincent agreed, "and wonderful, I can't wait." They saw the doctor the next week, who confirmed the pregnancy and estimated the baby would arrive in early May. Miriam continued working for Morrison until she was 7 months along, and then she reluctantly agreed to stay home as the pregnancy became more uncomfortable. She used the time to organize her records business, creating systems and filing methods that would allow her to pick up where she left off after the baby came. The baby arrived on a warm May afternoon, after 12 hours of labor that left Miriam exhausted and sweating and swearing she'd never do this again. But when the midwife placed the squalling infant in her arms and she saw Vincent's eyes shining with tears as he looked at his new son, she knew it had been worth it. They named him Edward, after Miriam's father. He had Vincent's hazel eyes and a shock of dark hair, and he was healthy and loud and perfect in every way. Vincent was a devoted father from the first moment, taking turns walking the floor with Edward when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, singing silly songs to make him smile. "You're a natural," Miriam told him one evening, watching him cradle Edward against his chest. "I had good parents," Vincent said softly. "I'm just trying to do what they would have done." Miriam felt a pang for the parents Vincent had lost so young, and for her own father who would never meet his grandson. But she also felt grateful that Edward would grow up with 2 parents who loved him and each other, who were building something solid and lasting. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Miriam started taking on records work again when Edward was 3 months old, working while he napped and in the evenings after Vincent came home and could take over baby care. It was exhausting trying to balance everything, but she was determined not to lose herself completely in motherhood. She needed the intellectual stimulation of her work, needed the satisfaction of building something of her own. Vincent understood, even when it meant he had to pick up more of the household duties than most men would have tolerated. He cooked dinner on the nights when Miriam was buried in paperwork. He did laundry and swept floors and never once complained that these weren't proper men's tasks. Their marriage was a true partnership, just as he'd promised it would be. When Edward was a year old, Vincent's ranch had grown to the point where he could afford to hire a part-time hand to help with the daily work, which meant he could spend more nights at home in town. The ranch now had 10 horses, the original mares and their offspring, plus the stallion and 2 geldings Vincent had trained and sold at a good profit. Robert Richardson had been so pleased with Vincent's success that he'd reduced his percentage stake in the business, saying that Vincent had more than proven himself capable of making the ranch viable. Miriam's records business had also grown. She now had enough clients that she was making almost as much from it as she had from her job with Morrison, and she was seriously considering leaving the law office to focus on her own enterprise full-time. Morrison, now in his 50s and thinking about reducing his workload, had actually suggested that she rent the office space next to his and establish herself as an independent business rather than his employee. "You've outgrown working for me," he told her one afternoon. "And this town has gotten big enough to support a dedicated records office. You were right about that from the beginning. I should have supported your original proposal to the town council." It was as close to an apology as the formal lawyer was likely to give, and Miriam accepted it graciously. She talked it over with Vincent, and they agreed that it was time. With both their businesses doing well, they could afford for Miriam to take the risk of going fully independent. The records office of Tucson officially opened in October of 1878, in a small but professional space next to Morrison's law office. Miriam hung a sign that she'd paid to have professionally painted, and she spent a week telling everyone she knew about the new business. The response exceeded her expectations, apparently. The town had indeed grown to the point where people were willing to pay for the convenience and expertise she offered. By the end of the first month, Miriam was busier than she'd ever been, handling everything from helping illiterate miners file claims to organizing estate documents for wealthy ranchers to tracking down missing birth certificates for people who needed them for legal purposes. She hired a young woman named Sarah Fletcher to help with the clerical work, which freed Miriam up to focus on the more complex tasks and on managing the business. "I'm proud of you," Vincent told her one evening as they sat on their porch, watching 2-year-old Edward play with his wooden blocks. "You built something real, something that matters. You proved all those men on the town council wrong." "We built it," Miriam corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you supporting me, believing in me." "Partners," Vincent said, taking her hand. "Partners," Miriam agreed. When Edward was 3, Miriam got pregnant again. This time the pregnancy felt easier, maybe because she knew what to expect, or maybe because she was just more settled in her life overall. The baby, a girl they named Caroline after Vincent's mother, arrived in early winter, a healthy child with a calm temperament that was the opposite of her brother's dramatic personality. With 2 children and 2 businesses to manage, life was chaotic but full. Miriam cut back her hours at the records office, letting Sarah handle more of the day-to-day operations, but she remained the face and brains of the business. Vincent's ranch continued to thrive, and he'd developed a strong enough reputation that he was starting to get orders from as far away as Phoenix for horses. They'd been married 5 years when Robert Richardson died suddenly of a heart problem, leaving Vincent shocked and grieving for the man who'd been a mentor and friend. In his will, Richardson left Vincent a generous sum of money and forgave the remainder of the loan on the ranch property, essentially giving Vincent free and clear ownership of his land. "He believed in me when nobody else did," Vincent said at the funeral, his voice thick with emotion. "He gave me a chance when I was just a cowboy with a dream." "He saw your worth," Miriam said, holding his hand. "Just like I did." Richardson's death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new phase in their lives. With the ranch debt cleared and some extra capital to work with, Vincent was able to expand his operation significantly. He bought more land, built a proper house on the ranch property, and increased his breeding stock. The ranch became successful enough that Vincent no longer needed to work as foreman anywhere. He could focus entirely on his own enterprise. They kept the house in town because Miriam's business was there, and because they liked being close to the amenities of Tucson, which was growing rapidly as the territory developed. But they spent weekends and holidays at the ranch, and as Edward and Caroline got older, they spent more time there, learning to ride and care for animals and appreciate the landscape that had shaped their parents' lives. When Edward was 8 and Caroline was 5, Miriam got pregnant again, a surprise baby that hadn't been planned but was welcomed nonetheless. This child was another boy, and they named him Robert after Richardson. He was a cheerful, easy child, and his siblings doted on him from the start. The years passed in a blur of work and family, and building something lasting. Miriam's records office became an institution in Tucson, the place everyone went when they needed official documents handled properly. She trained Sarah so thoroughly that eventually Sarah became a partner in the business, handling the operations while Miriam focused on complex cases and business development. Vincent's ranch became one of the most respected in the territory, known for producing intelligent, well-trained horses that were worth the premium price. He never got rich. Ranching was too uncertain and expensive for that, but he made a good living and had the satisfaction of working with animals he loved. Their marriage deepened over the years, moving from the passionate intensity of new love to something richer and more complex. They had their fights and frustrations, times when Miriam's stubbornness clashed with Vincent's patience, times when the stress of managing 2 businesses and 3 children made them short-tempered with each other. But they always came back together, always remembered why they'd chosen each other in the first place. "You remember when you told me you didn't need my help?" Vincent asked her one evening when they were in their 40s, sitting on the porch of the ranch house and watching the sunset paint the desert sky. "I remember being terrified of needing anyone," Miriam said. "I'd built such thick walls around my heart. And I was determined to prove I was worth the risk," Vincent said, smiling at the memory. "I must have driven you crazy showing up all the time." "You earned my trust one smile at a time," Miriam said softly. "You were so patient with me, even when I was pushing you away." "It was worth it," Vincent said, pulling her closer. "Every moment of waiting was worth it to have this life with you." "I love you," Miriam said, the words as natural now as breathing, though she remembered a time when they'd felt impossible to say. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I love you too," Vincent said. "And I never would have given up. Some things are worth fighting for, and you were always worth it." They sat together as the stars came out, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of knowing each other deeply. Inside the house, their children were laughing over some joke, and from the barn came the soft sounds of horses settling in for the night. It was a good life, built piece by piece through hard work and patience and love. Miriam had guarded her heart like gold for so long, terrified of the pain that came with loss. But Vincent had shown her that the risk of love was worth the reward, that building a life with someone you trusted was better than the loneliness of perfect safety. She'd learned that being strong didn't mean being alone, that true courage sometimes meant opening yourself up to the possibility of being hurt. As they grew older together, watching their children grow up and eventually marry and have children of their own, Miriam often thought about the woman she'd been at 23, standing at her father's grave and swearing she'd never let anyone close enough to hurt her again. That woman had been brave in her way, surviving grief and building a life despite the obstacles. But the woman she'd become, the one who'd let Vincent past her defenses and built a partnership based on trust and love, that woman was braver still. Edward grew up to be a lawyer like Morrison had been, taking over his practice when the old man finally retired. He married a teacher named Helen, and gave Miriam and Vincent 4 grandchildren. Caroline became a doctor, one of the first women physicians in the Arizona Territory, fighting against prejudice and doubt to practice medicine with skill and compassion. She married late to a fellow doctor, and they had 2 children together. Robert took over the ranch when Vincent was ready to slow down, showing the same gift with horses that his father had. Miriam and Vincent lived long enough to see the Arizona Territory become a state in 1912, to see Tucson transform from a dusty frontier town into a small city with electric lights and automobiles, and all the complications of modern life. They lived long enough to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. Vincent died first, at 74, his heart simply giving out one morning as he was getting dressed to go down to the barn. Miriam found him and knew immediately that he was gone, that the man who'd been her partner and her love for 5 decades had left her behind. The grief was crushing, the thing she'd feared most when she'd first tried to keep him at arm's length. But even through the pain, she didn't regret a single moment of their life together. She lived another 3 years without him, staying active in her business and with her family, but everyone could see that a part of her had gone with Vincent. She talked about him constantly, keeping his memory alive through stories and reminiscences. And when she died peacefully in her sleep at 77, her children agreed that she'd simply decided it was time to join him. They buried her next to Vincent on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the desert they'd both loved and the land they'd built their life on. The headstone read, Miriam Bailey, 1852–1929, beloved wife, mother, and pioneer. Next to her, Vincent's stone read Vincent Bailey, 1851–1926, horseman, partner, friend. At the funeral, Edward stood up to speak about his mother, his voice strong despite his tears. "My mother guarded her heart like gold," he said to the assembled crowd of family and friends. "She'd been hurt and was afraid to be hurt again, but my father was patient. He earned her trust one smile at a time, one kind gesture at a time, one day at a time. And together, they built something beautiful. They taught us that love isn't about being fearless. It's about being brave enough to take the risk even when you're afraid. That's the legacy they left us, and it's one we should all try to live up to." As the sun set over the desert that evening, the family gathered at the ranch house, sharing food and stories and memories. Caroline told about how her mother had encouraged her medical ambitions when everyone else said it was impossible for a woman. Robert talked about learning to train horses from his father, about the patience and understanding it required. The grandchildren shared their own memories, painting a picture of a woman who'd been strong and stubborn and loving, who'd built a business and a family and a life that mattered. And if the wind that evening seemed to carry whispers of laughter, if the desert seemed to hold echoes of 2 voices intertwined, well, perhaps that was just the landscape remembering its own. Perhaps it was the land itself acknowledging what Miriam and Vincent had built together, the legacy of love and trust that would ripple forward through generations. Their story had started with loss and fear, with walls built high to keep out pain. But it had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of patience, the value of trust, and the courage it takes to open your heart even when you're terrified. Vincent had shown Miriam that love was worth the risk, and together they'd proven that the best things in life are built slowly, carefully, one smile at a time. In the end, that was the truth that outlasted everything else. Not the businesses they'd built, or the land they'd acquired, or even the children they'd raised, though all of those mattered. The truth that endured was simpler and more profound. That two people had found each other in a harsh and unforgiving time and place, had chosen each other despite all the reasons not to, and had built a life together that was richer and fuller than either could have built alone. And that truth, that simple and powerful truth, was the greatest legacy anyone could hope to leave behind.